In this video, we're going to go through the steps that it takes to get a good bass drum recording sound, and we're going to do it on a budget. We're going to use inexpensive microphones, and we're even going to be experimental in the fact that we're going to try to do this pre-recording. All of our effects, in other words, the compression and EQ, are going to go on prior to it recording so that those changes are permanent. We're going to experiment with compression and EQ and mic placement. So let's get started. I have here a vintage, it's a 1975 22-inch Ludwig maple drum. It's even got the original Speed King pedal, old squeaky Speed King, from my childhood. And we're going to make this thing sound good. The head is fairly loose, but it's not so loose that there's any distortion or wrinkling around the head, and it's still tight enough to keep some tone. I've got some damping in it. I've got a sweater and a towel, I think. It's just some cloth just to stop all the ringing, and you can kind of thump on it. You can still hear a good solid tone, because we're going to bring that out with the EQ. From there, I'm going to go straight into a compressor, straight into the recording interface, straight to the digital audio workstation. So let's stop here and I'll show you the other side of the drum where the microphone placement is going to be. Okay, here we are on the resonant head side of the drum. There's a hole in this resonant head, and it's in the center because that's where I beat a hole through it with that self-same Speed King over the years. But I'm not going to throw it away, so I enlarged it and I put tape around the edge there so that it doesn't rattle and make all kinds of funny noises we don't want picking up in the microphone. I've got my sweater in here. Some people use a blanket or a pillow, and there's opinions as to whether or not you should put it in the center or off to the side. This is recording on a budget for your typical home studio recording enthusiast, and I'm not going to cut a perfectly good drum head just to put a hole in the side of it when I get the same sound that I want out of the center. The microphone we're going to be using is a Radio Shack total bottom of the line microphone, but it records sound. And if this is all we have, then this is what we're going to use. I'll place it inside the head. And I'm going to go in about 5 inches. Make sure that the boom arm isn't touching the head so it doesn't shake or rattle. And I'm going to be slightly off center so it's not looking directly at the beater, which will be important later because we'll get that nice click or thwack sound. We're going to pull that out of the recording. I have a wooden beater on the other side, and that makes a nice click, a very well defined click, and we're going to pull that out. But we don't want too much by looking directly at it because it'll overemphasize it. So we have our drum, we have the microphone in place. Let's go ahead and get some sample audio going here. All right, let's start off by looking at signal flow. As I said earlier, that microphone in front of the bass drum goes directly into my compressor, which is a DSP-based compressor. It's all digital, and then from there it goes into the 4-channel Euphoria UMC 404 digital interface for the recording side, and then into my DAW. All right, so let's look at the signal flow here. First thing it hits is my compressor. And if you'll notice, the compressor is very poorly set. These are not the kind of settings that would ideally be used in a compressor. I've got a ridiculously fast attack time. Release time is also really fast. It's useless. I've got it set for a very high level, 3 decibels. That means the signal will have to rise up to 3 decibels before it'll even start working. And some crazy compression rate of 26.4 to 1, which is basically limiting and not even compression. So let's listen what that sounds like, and we'll see what a very poorly adjusted compressor sounds like. Okay, we saw plenty of input deflection, but we didn't see any compression taking place, and that's because it's just not adjusted properly. So the first thing we're going to adjust is the threshold. That's one of the most important, because that sets the point at which the compressor turns on. Now, the great thing about threshold is it's one of those things that you can see. It's not one that you have to rely on your hearing. So as a beginner who's just getting used to using a compressor, this is a nice first point to take off from. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take this threshold and I'm going to go way in the opposite direction. We're going to make it so that every single signal coming into it gets compressed. I got it set for neg 60. Those are very weak signals, and you'll notice that the compressor will now kick in. So let's see that happen. All right. Now what we saw was a lot of compressor kicking in. So much, in fact, that the signal is barely audible. So let's find us a happy medium. Through experimentation on this thing, I have found that a threshold of about neg 46 is what I need. And let's go ahead and set it there. The way I came about that was I kind of put it in the middle. I went a little bit high and I went a little bit low, and I listened to what I thought would be just what it needed. And what it does is it allows that compression bar, that downward gain indicator, to show some activity on the very hard hits and not so much on the lighter taps, because we don't need to compress them as much. We want to bring them up into the mix. So let's see what it sounds like now. All right, what you noticed there was an indication that on my strong hits, the compressor was kicking in. On the lighter hits, not so heavy. All right. Now the rest of these you have to rely on your hearing to set. And the next one that's easiest is your compression level, or your ratio. That one is not as difficult to set because there's a lot of opinion about the level or the ratio that you should use for which drum, which situation. And you know, the common consensus is on bass drums anywhere from 3 to 5 to 1 is good. So anything from 3 to 1 all the way up to 5 to 1 is good. I find that 3 to 1 is a good ratio, because what it does is it it offers enough compression to achieve the result that you're working for, but it's not over compressing, especially since we're doing pre-compression recording. In other words, the recording that we're doing is being permanently printed with these changes on it. We don't want a lot of exaggeration in our settings. So we'll go with 3 to 1. And what that means simply is that for every decibel that rises above the threshold, which in our case is neg 46, we are going to get a corresponding 3 dB reduction in that signal. And if that signal were to rise 2 dB above threshold, then it would be 6 dBs of compression to reduce that level in the 3 to 1 format. All right, so now then let's listen to that. We've improved on 2 of these settings so far. We've got a threshold that'll work for our equipment, and that's important that you know that, because you can go online and find all these recommended settings for compressors, but they don't take into effect your equipment. With a different microphone and a different situation, that, you know, like moving the mic outside of the bass drum where it's not as strong a signal, all these threshold levels are going to change. So you have to constantly be aware of that. You can't just take those settings, plug them into your compressors, and you're off to the races. You got to fiddle with them. That's part of, you know, engineering your sound. All right, so let's see what that sounds like. All right, it's getting better, but there's still a lot of room for improvement. The next thing we're going to do is change our attack and release times. What that'll do is allow us to get more of the signal in that we want. And here is that explained as simply as I can. When the signal rises to your threshold level, the compressor is not going to compress immediately. It's going to wait just a small fraction of time before it starts compressing. And that wait time is the attack time. So if I have a very, very quick, which I do, attack time, that compressor is going to work almost immediately. It's not going to allow any of that initial transit to get through. That carries the punch, you know, that solid hit. So you want to let some of that through. And all these compression settings and advice that I'm trying to expand upon are mainly for percussion instruments. They apply to everything, but these numbers work well with percussion. And the reason for that is because on attack times, we're going to want a fast attack time, but not quite that fast, because with a transit from a percussive hit, it doesn't take very long for it to rise from nothing to its maximum value. When you smack that snare drum or hit that tom or beat that bass drum, the moment that you hit it, just a few milliseconds later, it's already maxed out and it's already coming down. So we want to let some of that through, but if we let too much of it through, we might as well not be compressing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this and I'm going to go way too high. Right now I'm way too low. Let's put it up to 89 milliseconds. That's going to be way beyond a typical attack time for a drum. So let's see what that sounds like. Now that let more of the signal through and it allowed it to compress, but it let the entire transit through. So what's happened is, because we let the entire transit through and not stopped it at that sweet spot, that means we compressed all of the signal. So what it did was, as that signal was falling down, it was compressing that as well, so it kind of, smeared out the sound a little bit. Let's find us a happy medium. Through experimentation, I have found that an attack time of about 18 milliseconds, and this will hold true even with your compressor. The attack and release times are very consistent equipment to equipment. It's mainly the threshold that you'll have trouble with. So let's try this 18 millisecond attack time, and we'll see what part of the signal comes through. All right, now then we've got a fairly decent signal coming through, and it also has a lot less of the transient is not coming through. The part that's peaking out is coming in, and the part that's starting to fall off, it's compressing because it's already way above threshold, and we're saying, okay, now go ahead and start compressing. And it is. Release time, what that does is it allows the compressor to stay on for that amount of time, even after the signal has gone below the threshold. What this does is it keeps the compressor armed, so that if that signal does rise above threshold before that time, the compressor's already engaged, and it will make a much smoother compression signal. You won't get these weird artifacts in your sound where it'll pump, or you hear an unnatural sound, because what's happening is you're achieving threshold, you wait that attack second, you're compressing, and then you're going to do it right away before it ever has a chance to finish, and that makes the compressor work funny. So release is a way of keeping it on intentionally over a certain amount of time, and that is to, you can, in a snare you might miss ghost notes because they happen so quickly in succession, and this is just a way of making the compressor work better for your particular situation. It may be a completely different scenario for, say, an acoustic guitar. Now then, I've got an extremely fast release time, so as soon as that signal hits threshold, it's turning off, and it's arming itself for the next compression, and that's why it sounds like that. Let's go the other way. Let's go way too long. Let's keep the compressor on for an abnormally long period of time for a percussion instrument. This right here is well over half a second. So let's see what that sounds like. Okay? But what I've found, that somewhere in between there, between way too fast and way too slow, is a great number. And through experimentation, I've found that about 60 milliseconds for this bass drum works well. So I'm going to plug that in, and that'll complete all of the compressor settings that we need to worry about at this time. All right. So let me close that out now. We'll listen to it one time while it's compressed properly. there towards the end, I went from very soft hits to very strong hits, and you can see how well the compressor kept up with that. Now then, let's look at some EQ settings. We have our compressor set properly now, and that's gone a long ways to improving our tone, but now let's go ahead and try to fatten that sound up a little bit, and we're going to do that with an equalizer. Okay, now what we're going to do is move on to EQ. Now, one thing that I didn't do for you, and I'm going to do it now, is we're going to listen to the drum with everything completely flat. I'm going to bypass the compressor because I don't think there's an appreciation for what compression can do before you start EQing. So listen to the same setup, the same drum, everything, it's all identical. I've just bypassed the compressor. So here is a raw recording of that drum through that microphone. Okay, so that'll give a better idea of what that drum sounds like. It's very squashed and it doesn't have a very good tone to it. But with that compressor engaged, we can move on to our EQ. Now then, this is where you have to listen again, because your bass drum is different than my bass drum. If you have a bigger bass drum or a smaller bass drum, these center frequencies are going to be a little bit different, but they're all basically in the same place. There's harsh sounds and there's good sounds that you want to pull out of that drum. And if you have a parametric EQ, it's real easy to find it, because all you have to do is crank up the gain, sweep the frequency back and forth till you hear that really obnoxious sound, then cut that one out. So let's look at what we want to emphasize and what we want to put in. And I had a lot of problems with this starting off because I didn't know where to start. So I went online and I looked at all the various blogs and YouTube videos and instructionals on how to EQ a bass. And I found a recurring theme. So I said, okay, they must be right because so many people want to do this. Well, around 45 hertz, and that's where it is with this bass drum. Now yours might be as low as 40 and as high as 60. You have to find that by listening and recording it over and over, playing it back, and you'll find it. So on this relatively flat scale here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in a 45 hertz parametric EQ, and I'm going to boost it quite a bit. It's a lot more than I would typically do, but it works and it sounds good. I'm going to put 11 decibels of gain in here. I mean, you can see now that that bottom end is fat, and the bandwidth is my drop-off points at a predetermined level depending on the type of parametric you're using. I want that wide, so you can see that it's actually picking up as low as 20 and as high as 100. It's pulling all that up and putting it into the recording. The next thing I want to do, well, before I do that, let me let you hear what the drum sounds like with just that change to the system. All right, now then, so that helped our low end, and What I've also found, and again, this is from looking at all the other external sources of information, is that around 250 is where it's always suggested that you should cut it, and you should. But on my particular drum, it's actually at 283. I had to go plus and minus until I found it. But there's a particularly annoying frequency in that range. It's kind of a nasally bass sound. And when you pull that out, it lets that low end bump breathe better, and then the high end will have more room to adjust. You'll see. So let's go ahead and pull that out. Let's see, I had 283 hertz at minus 9.7. I had 283 hertz at minus 9.7. So let me pull that out. And it's also a very wide curve. In fact, let's see here, I think, yeah, it's even wider than, I'm actually pulling more out than I put in as far as bandwidth. So I scooped a lot out in that annoying range. Let's see what that's done to the signal. All right. And then what else I've done is I wanted to emphasize the click. That's what helps the drum sound get through the mix, especially at lower volumes. You can hear that in a lot of professional recordings. The bass drum is audible even at very low volumes because what you're hearing isn't really even a bass sound. It's just something to give you that perceived feel of the bass drum. And on mine, now mine's kind of low. I've got it just below 2 kilohertz, but most of the informational sources say that that click is located anywhere from 2.5 to 4 kilohertz. But on mine, this particular drum with that particular wooden beater and the way it's set up, I've got that coming in at about 1.97. So let me find that one, and I'm going to drop that out a little bit. Now you may have to add this on yours. If you're using a soft beater, you might want to add some click. On mine, it actually has enough click that I feel like I need to pull that out, and I'm pulling it out about almost 3 dBs. And that little bump right there has tamed that very aggressive batter head click sound that wooden beater puts in there, and the proximity of that microphone to the batter, I'm cutting it out. You may have to add it. All right, and then what else I've found is there's always a certain amount of high that is added in, and I've got, that's about 7K. That just kind of adds a little clarity to the signal. It's not really even a bass frequency. When you get up at 7 kilohertz, that's a very high sound. But all those harmonics and all those components of that bass hit, when they're missing at those frequencies, it results in kind of a muddy, unclear bass sound. So, you know, when I first started doing this, I figured I would have me a curve that emphasized the entire low end and just cut everything else off from there. And I'm like, there, now I got me some bass. That didn't work. I had to go back to school and figure out why. And this is why. You actually need some of those highs in there to make that bass sound clear. So let's add those in. I've got a 7,000 hertz at about 1.7 dB of gain, which is almost 2 dB, just a little bit of a bump there. And this is going to round out the sound. Let's go ahead and listen to the overall sound now with all of our compression and equalizer settings added in. All right, so now then we have the complete sound for that bass drum. And you can see that you don't need a lot of fancy equipment. A microphone, a compressor of some sort, and some patience in going through those settings. So I hope that helped try to round out, some questions you had, or sometimes just seeing a different point of view on things helps you figure things out. But I'll be posting some more things like this. Maybe we'll move on to the snare and the type of microphone and placement for it. But hope you enjoy. Thank you.